In October 2009, the newly elected Greek Prime Minister, George Papandreou, sat down with his finance ministers and learned something that almost no incoming head of government has ever had to confront so directly. The budget deficit he had inherited was not 6% of GDP, the figure his predecessor had reported. To the European Union, it was 12.7%, nearly double. The books had been managed, the numbers smoothed. The gap between official reality and actual reality concealed long enough to win an election, long enough to maintain market confidence, long enough to avoid the conversation that everyone in the room knew was coming. Greece did not fall because it was uniquely corrupt or uniquely reckless. It fell because it had borrowed its way to the edge and then borrowed a little more to avoid admitting it. The United States has borrowed $35 trillion. Nobody in Washington is calling a meeting to tell you what the books actually say. What are they hiding and how much time is left? On March 28, 2007, Ben Bernanke sat before the U.S. Joint Economic Committee and delivered a sentence that has since become one of the most studied miscalculations in the history of central banking. The impact on the broader economy and financial markets of the problems in the subprime market, he said, seems likely to be contained. 18 months later, the United States experienced the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Over $10 trillion in household wealth was destroyed. 8 million Americans lost their jobs. The global financial system required the largest government intervention in peacetime history just to remain functional. Bernanke was not lying. He genuinely believed what he said. That is precisely what makes the statement so revealing, not as evidence of individual failure, but as evidence of institutional design. The Federal Reserve's operating framework, built over a century of precedent and practice, systematically prioritizes the projection of confidence over the communication of risk, not because officials are dishonest, because they have concluded rationally within the logic of the institution that the alternative is worse. Consider what happens if a Federal Reserve chairman stands before Congress and says, "The system is more fragile than we are publicly acknowledging, and we are not certain we can contain the consequences of a significant shock." The statement, if true, would be the most responsible thing a central bank official could say. It would also immediately trigger the very crisis it was describing. The bank run, the bond market sell-off, the credit contraction, all would begin within hours of the honest assessment being made public. This is the paradox that has governed modern central banking since at least the 1990s. Transparency is destabilizing. Opacity is therefore policy. In September 2007, British banking customers experienced this paradox in real time. Northern Rock, a mid-sized mortgage lender, had become dangerously dependent on short-term wholesale funding to finance its long-term mortgage book. When the interbank lending market froze in August 2007, Northern Rock's business model became instantly unviable. The Bank of England knew, Financial Services Authority knew, the Treasury knew. For weeks, discussions occurred at the highest levels of British financial regulation about how to manage the situation quietly, without triggering public alarm. Then a single BBC report confirmed the Bank of England was providing emergency support. Within 24 hours, queues had formed outside every Northern Rock branch in Britain. People stood in lines stretching around city blocks to withdraw their savings. The first bank run in Britain in 150 years triggered not by the underlying problem, which had existed for weeks, but by the moment the information about the problem reached the public. The regulators had not been wrong to manage the information carefully. The bank run proved their concern was justified. But their caution also meant that when the truth emerged, as it inevitably did, the public had no framework for understanding what was happening or why, and panic filled the vacuum. This is the operating environment of the Federal Reserve in 2025 and 2026, an institution that holds more information about the fragility of the financial system than any other entity on Earth, an institution that is structurally incapable of communicating that information fully and honestly, because doing so would accelerate the crisis it is trying to prevent, and an institution that has, over the past 20 years, repeatedly demonstrated that it will choose the projection of confidence over the communication of risk right up until the moment when the gap between the two becomes impossible to maintain. The Federal Reserve is not hiding the truth because it is malicious. It is hiding the truth because that is what the institution was built to do. The question that matters, the only question that matters, is how. wide the gap has become between what they are saying and what they know. There is a story about Venezuela that almost nobody tells correctly. In 2001, Venezuela was not a failed state. It was a middle-income country with the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Iran, larger than Iraq. Its currency was stable, its institutions were functioning, its middle class was real and growing. The country had problems, inequality, corruption, political instability, but these were the problems of a nation with options, not the problems of a nation in terminal decline. By 2019, Venezuela's annual inflation rate was 53,798,500%. Supermarket shelves were empty. The currency had been redenominated twice, removing 6 zeros from the bolivar, and was still worthless. An estimated 5.4 million Venezuelans had fled the country. Children were dying of diseases that had been eradicated in the region for decades. What happened between 2001 and 2019 was not a war. It was not a natural disaster. It was arithmetic specifically, the arithmetic of a government that spent more than its revenue, funded the difference by printing money, and continued this process long past the point where any honest accounting could have justified it. The oil wealth, real, enormous, genuinely transformative, was used not to build diversified productive capacity, but to fund current consumption and maintain political loyalty. When the oil price fell and the borrowing became unsustainable, the government responded not by adjusting, but by printing and printing. The United States is not Venezuela. This comparison will frustrate some viewers, and it should. The differences are real and significant. But the mechanisms spend more than you earn, fund the gap through monetary expansion, defer the adjustment until the adjustment becomes catastrophic, is not Venezuelan. It is universal. It is the mechanism that has operated in every currency collapse in recorded history, from the Roman denarius to the Ottoman piaster. Here is what the U.S. debt trajectory actually looks like in human terms. In the 12 months of fiscal year 2023, the United States federal government collected approximately $4.4 trillion in tax revenue. It spent approximately $6.1 trillion. The deficit, the gap between what came in and what went out, was $1.7 trillion. Not during a recession, not during a war. During a period of historically low unemployment and above-average economic growth, that $1.7 trillion deficit was financed by issuing new treasury bonds, new promises to pay, with interest at some point in the future. The interest on those bonds and on all the bonds issued in previous years consumed $659 billion of the $4.4 trillion in tax revenue. 15 cents of every tax dollar collected went purely to servicing the cost of past borrowing, producing nothing, building nothing, funding nothing except the maintenance of a financial obligation that grows larger each year. The Ottoman Empire in 1875 was spending more than half its tax revenue on debt service. The year it crossed that threshold, it defaulted. The European creditors then established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a body of foreign officials given direct control over Ottoman customs revenue. The empire lost sovereignty over its own finances before it lost its territory. The United States is not at 50% of tax revenue going to debt service. Not yet. But the trajectory of the Congressional Budget Office's projections, which are not conspiracy theories but the U.S. government's own official forecasts, shows interest payments reaching $1 trillion annually by 2026, and continuing to rise from there under any plausible economic scenario that does not involve either significant growth, acceleration, or significant fiscal contraction. Neither is currently in prospect. The difference between the U.S. situation and Venezuela's is not one of mechanism. It is one of scale, of institutional depth, of the dollar's reserve currency status, and of time. Time is the variable that the $35 trillion number is steadily consuming, and the Ottoman Empire in 1874 also believed it had more time than it did. In the year 1025, the Byzantine Empire was the wealthiest, most sophisticated state in the Christian world. Its capital, Constantinople, was home to perhaps 400,000 people, larger than any city in Western Europe. Its currency, the gold solidus, had maintained its purity and weight for over 700 years, the longest-running stable currency in human history. Byzantine merchants traded from the Silk Road to the Atlantic. Byzantine diplomacy shaped the politics of a continent. Byzantine art, law, and theology defined civilization for hundreds of millions of people across 3 continents. By 1453, 428 years later, Constantinople had fallen to the Ottoman Turks. The empire was gone. The solidus was gone. The civilization that had preserved and transmitted the knowledge of antiquity through Europe's darkest centuries had been extinguished. It did not happen suddenly. It happened in 7 stages, stages that are, in their broad structure, identical to the stages visible in the United States today. Stage 1. Overextension. The Byzantine military, under Emperor Basil II, reached its maximum extent in 1025. Maintaining those borders required resources the empire's tax base could not indefinitely supply. For the United States, overextension spans 2001 to 2020, 2 wars costing $8 trillion. A financial system bailed out at public expense, a global military presence in over 140 nations. Stage 2. Debt normalization. After Basil II's death, successive Byzantine emperors began systematically debasing the solidus, reducing its gold content to fund expenditure the tax system could no longer cover. The debasement happened gradually enough that each generation accepted as normal what the previous generation would have considered alarming. For the United States, quantitative easing, the Federal Reserve's systematic expansion of the money supply, has been normalized across 3 separate cycles since 2008. Stage 3. Rate suppression. Byzantine commercial rates were artificially managed through imperial edicts on lending. American interest rates were held at near zero for 14 consecutive years, the longest sustained. Financial repression in U.S. history, quietly transferring wealth from savers to the government and to leveraged asset holders. Stage 4. Asset inflation. Constantinople's real estate, its luxury goods markets, its financial instruments all reflected not genuine productive wealth creation, but the distortion of artificially cheap money seeking returns. American equity markets tripled between 2012 and 2021. Residential real estate appreciated 60% nationally. The wealth was real on paper. It was also in significant part a reflection of monetary policy rather than economic fundamentals. Stage 5. Cracks appear. In March 2023, Silicon Valley Bank, the 16th largest bank in the United States, failed in 48 hours. 2 days later, Signature Bank failed. Within 60 days, First Republic Bank, with $229 billion in assets, was seized by regulators. 3 significant U.S. banks, gone. The official verdict contained: idiosyncratic, resolved. The honest verdict: Stage 5 had arrived. Stage 6. Confidence fracture. This is the stage that central banks fear most. Not panic. Panic is loud and brief. Confidence fracture is quiet. A pension fund shifts 5% of its treasury allocation to gold. A sovereign wealth fund extends its dollar hedge. A multinational begins pricing contracts in euros. 10,000 small, rational decisions that collectively begin to erode the faith on which the entire system depends. The United States is approaching this stage now. It has not fully arrived. But the behavioral signals, central bank gold purchases at record levels globally, declining foreign treasury holdings, BRICS, expansion, suggest the approach is not theoretical. Stage 7. The reckoning. This is where every empire that has followed these stages eventually arrives. It's not always catastrophically, not always quickly, but inevitably. The Byzantine Empire, Stage 7, took 4 centuries. Britain's took 3 decades. Argentina's took 3 years. The United States, in 2026, stands between Stage 5 and Stage 6. The distance between Stage 6 and Stage 7 is not measured in years. It is measured in confidence. And confidence, as every empire in this list discovered too late, is not rebuilt once it is lost. It relocates to another currency, another system, another center of gravity. The question is not whether Stage 7 is coming. The question is whether you understand what it looks like when it arrives. A currency does not die from a single wound. It dies from a sequence, a cascade of events, each one seemingly manageable in isolation, that collectively overwhelm the system's capacity to absorb them. Turkey understood this painfully. In 2021, the Turkish lira had been weakening for years, gradually, then more sharply. As President Erdogan's government pursued an unorthodox monetary policy that cut interest rates in response to inflation rather than raising them, the logic, Erdogan insisted publicly, was that high interest rates caused inflation rather than controlled it, a position contradicted by virtually every central bank and economic institution on Earth. Markets responded with skepticism. The lira declined. The government held firm. In November 2021, the lira lost 15% of its value in a single week. By the end of 2021, it had lost 44% of its value against the dollar in a single year. Turkish households watched the purchasing power of their savings collapse in real time. Inflation hit 85% in 2022. Ordinary Turks rushed to convert lira savings into dollars, gold, and cryptocurrency, anything that held value better than their national currency. The flight itself accelerated the lira's decline. Turkey's crisis was triggered not by a single dramatic event, but by the accumulated loss of confidence in the institution managing the currency. A confidence loss that, once it reached a critical threshold, became self-reinforcing. The United States faces three specific triggers that could initiate exactly this kind of cascade in the 2026 to 2028 window. Trigger 1, the Treasury market event. The $27 trillion U.S. Treasury market is the foundation of global finance. In March 2020, it briefly stopped functioning. Bid-ask spreads blew out. Dealers withdrew. The Federal Reserve had to purchase $75 billion per day for 4 consecutive days just to restore basic operation. The basis trade hedge fund leverage in treasuries estimated at $800 billion by the BIS in 2023 has grown, not shrunk, since that near miss. A repeat event in a higher inflation environment where the Fed's emergency response carries greater credibility risk may not be as cleanly contained. Trigger 2, the commercial real estate collapse. Between 2024 and 2026, $1.5 trillion in commercial real estate loans are maturing. Loans originated at 3%. Interest against property values that have since declined 30% to 50% in a refinancing environment where rates are 6% to 8%. The mathematics of refinancing these loans for a large proportion of borrowers simply does not work. The 67% of these loans held by U.S. regional banks represents concentrated exposure in institutions that are already carrying hundreds of billions in unrealized securities losses. When defaults begin surfacing at scale, not if the credit contraction that follows will reach into every corner of the real economy. Trigger 3, the de-dollarization signal. Lebanon offers the most visceral recent illustration of what happens when a population loses faith in its currency simultaneously. The Lebanese pound, fixed to the dollar since 1997, collapsed in 2020 when the government could no longer maintain the peg. Bank accounts were frozen, dollar withdrawals were restricted. Citizens who had deposited dollars received Lebanese pounds at the official rate, watching their savings lose 90% of their value through a conversion they did not choose and could not prevent. The BRICS expansion of 2024, adding Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, and Egypt, does not create an overnight dollar alternative, but it creates the institutional architecture within which one could emerge. A sufficiently significant de-dollarization signal, a major commodity priced in yuan, a Gulf sovereign bond issued in a non-dollar currency, could trigger the behavioral shift that turns gradual erosion into sudden fracture. These three triggers are not predictions. They're documented vulnerabilities. They are live. They are measurable. And they are, in the 2026 to 2028 window, converging. In the year 2000, Ecuador did something that no country in the Western Hemisphere had done before. Faced with a banking system that had collapsed, an inflation rate above 60%, in a currency, the sucre that had lost 75% of its value in a single year, Ecuador abolished its own money. On January 9, 2000, President Jamil Mahua announced that Ecuador would adopt the U.S. dollar as its official currency. The sucre, which had existed since 1884, ceased to exist. Ecuadorians woke to find that the medium of exchange they had used their entire lives was being replaced by a foreign currency issued by a foreign central bank, over which they had zero control. The dollarization worked in narrow economic terms. Inflation fell. The banking system stabilized. Ecuador has maintained the dollar ever since. But the decision carried a cost that the economic statistics do not capture. A nation surrendered its monetary sovereignty, its ability to set interest rates, manage its own currency, respond to economic shocks with its own tools, in exchange for the stability of borrowing someone else's credibility. This is the destination that every financial playbook eventually reaches when the earlier moves have been exhausted. Zimbabwe reached it in 2009, abandoning the Zimbabwean dollar, which had experienced inflation of 89.76% at its peak in November 2008, in favor of a basket of foreign currencies dominated by the US dollar. The process of getting there had taken a decade. First the money printing, then the price controls, then the asset seizures. Then the currency redenominations, 6 zeros removed, then 12 zeros more, and finally, the total collapse of confidence in the domestic monetary system. The playbook that empires and nations follow when debt becomes unmanageable runs in 3 distinct phases, and its application is consistent across political systems, geographies, and centuries. Phase 1 is denial. Statistics are managed. Unfavorable data is reclassified or delayed. The official message is resilience. The official tone is confidence. Dissenting voices are described as alarmist, as politically motivated, as failing to understand the unique strengths of the system. The United States is in Phase 1 now, has been since approximately 2021, the CPI methodology revisions, the U3 versus U6 unemployment distinction, the GDP accounting that includes government spending as productive output. None of these are fraudulent individually. Collectively, they produce an official picture consistently more favorable than the underlying experience of the median household. Phase 2 is control. When denial becomes untenable, the state moves to preserve its financial position by constraining the options of its own population. Capital controls, wealth taxes, currency reform, asset reporting requirements framed as compliance measures, the infrastructure for Phase 2 in the United States, comprehensive financial surveillance, central bank digital currency development, mandatory reporting of financial accounts is being built now, quietly justified at each step by reasonable-sounding policy rationales. The Portuguese Empire in the 1580s did something analogous when it began restricting the export of gold and silver from its colonies, not because the restriction made long-term sense, but because the short-term alternative was watching its monetary base drain away. The restriction delayed the reckoning. It did not prevent it. Within a decade, Portugal had been absorbed by Spain. Its financial sovereignty extinguished more thoroughly than any currency collapse could have managed. Phase 3 is debasement. This is the phase from which no reserve currency has historically recovered its previous position. Once the printing press is running to fund government expenditure directly, not to stimulate a cycle, not as emergency liquidity, but as the primary mechanism for closing a structural deficit, the confidence that underpins the currency begins its terminal erosion. The question for the United States is not whether this playbook is being followed. The trajectory of policy since 2008 maps onto it with uncomfortable precision. The question is how far along the playbook has run, and how much distance remains between the current moment and the phase from which there is no return. Ecuador and Zimbabwe both found stability after their reckonings, but they found it in someone else's currency. What does America borrow when America's credibility runs out? In 1945, Japan was in ruins. Its cities were ash. Its navy was at the bottom of the Pacific. Its military, once the dominant force in the largest ocean on Earth, had been destroyed. Its emperor had surrendered unconditionally on August 15, 1945. In a radio broadcast so extraordinary, the first time the Japanese public had ever heard the emperor's voice, that listeners initially could not comprehend what they were being told. Japan had not lost a war in modern history. It had now lost the largest one ever fought. And yet, within 25 years, Japan had rebuilt itself into the world's second-largest economy. Within 40 years, Japanese companies were buying American landmarks. Within 50 years, Japanese manufacturing and technology set the global standard in industry after industry. The reconstruction was not miraculous. It was the product of extraordinary discipline, institutional cooperation, American investment, and a population that channeled its trauma into productivity with a focus that remains, decades later, historically unmatched. Japan's story is told here not as a reason for optimism about what reckoning produces. It is told as a demonstration of what is possible after a reckoning, when the adjustment, however brutal, clears the accumulated distortions and allows a system to rebuild on honest foundations. The United States has not experienced that clearing. It has, for 20 years, successfully deferred it through monetary expansion, through fiscal stimulus, through the institutional management of confidence. Each deferral has been presented as a solution. Each solution has produced the conditions for a larger problem. And the accumulated weight of those deferred problems now sits inside a financial system that is, by any honest historical measure, more structurally fragile than it has been at any point since the 1930s. This is not pessimism. It is arithmetic. Arithmetic does not respond to communication strategy. The Nicaraguan Cordoba offers a final, quiet illustration of how this ends. Nicaragua, in the 1980s, funded its revolutionary government through monetary expansion, printing Cordobas to pay for a civil war, a trade embargo, and a state apparatus that its tax base could not support. By 1988, annual inflation had reached 33,000%. The government introduced a new currency, the new Cordoba, at a conversion rate of 1,000 old Cordobas per new one. Within 2 years, the new Cordoba was itself inflating catastrophically. A third currency, the gold Cordoba, was introduced in 1990. It took the better part of a decade and the end of the political circumstances that had driven the monetary expansion before Nicaragua had a functional currency again. The lesson is not that Nicaragua is like America. The lesson is that once a monetary system loses the confidence of its users, restoring that confidence requires not just better policy, it requires a fundamentally different political context. The confidence cannot be announced back into existence, cannot be managed back into existence. It has to be earned back into existence through a sustained period of discipline and transparency that is the opposite of what produced the crisis. Singapore offers the contrast. In 1965, Singapore was expelled from Malaysia, a small island of under 2 million people, with no natural resources, no hinterland, no obvious economic basis for survival as an independent state. Its founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew wept publicly when he announced independence. Singapore, he said, was a heartbroken nation. Within 3 decades, Singapore had built one of the most stable, respected currencies in Asia. The Singapore dollar maintained its value through monetary discipline so consistent that the Monetary Authority of Singapore became a model studied by central banks worldwide. The stability was not achieved through resource wealth or geographic advantage. It was achieved through institutional commitment to a single principle. The currency must reflect economic reality, not political convenience. That principle, the currency must reflect reality, is the one that every empire in this documentary has eventually been forced to confront. Spain confronted it through bankruptcy. The Ottomans confronted it through foreign receivership. Britain confronted it through imperial dissolution. Soviet Union confronted it through disintegration. United States has not yet confronted it. The Federal Reserve will hold its next press conference. Language will be careful, calibrated, and designed to project the confidence that the institution believes the system requires. Some of what is said will be true. Some of what is known will not be said. And the gap between those two things, between the official narrative and the underlying arithmetic, will continue to grow. The question that no one at the Fed will answer, the question this documentary has spent 40 minutes asking, is the simplest one in finance. What happens when the gap closes? Not if. History has answered that question too many times to leave any doubt. When? And whether when it does, America sits at the table as the architect of what comes next, or as the nation whose currency the next system is designed to replace.